In the winter of 1950, the mountains of North Korea became a place of unimaginable suffering. A place where men froze standing up, where rifles jammed with ice, where the wind could kill as quickly as bullets, and where a small force of United Nations troops faced an enemy that outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. It was a place that would be remembered not for victory or defeat, but for survival, for endurance, for the unbreakable will of the Marines and soldiers who fought there. That place was the Chosin Reservoir. Today, the name Chosin evokes images of frozen lakes, snow-covered hills, and long, desperate marches through blizzards that cut to the bone. But to understand how such a tragedy unfolded, we must look back to the months before the battle, to a time when victory seemed close and confidence ran dangerously high. In the summer of 1950, the United Nations forces in Korea had been fighting desperately to hold the Pusan perimeter. North Korean troops, backed by Soviet weapons and training, pushed them to the brink. But the tide turned dramatically in September, with General Douglas MacArthur's daring landing at Incheon. The sudden amphibious assault shattered North Korean supply lines and sent their armies reeling back toward the north. Seoul was recaptured. The entire momentum of the war shifted in a matter of weeks. By October, United Nations forces were no longer fighting for survival. They were advancing deep into North Korea, pushing toward the Yalu River, the border with China. Many believed the war was nearly over. MacArthur famously declared his troops would be home by Christmas. Newspapers printed optimistic headlines. Morale soared. But optimism can be dangerous. As UN troops pushed north, reports began to filter in of large numbers of Chinese soldiers crossing the Yalu River. At first, these sightings were dismissed or downplayed. A few scouting encounters were brushed off as minor infiltrations. MacArthur and his intelligence staff believed China would not risk open intervention. Even when captured prisoners admitted they were part of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, many commanders believed they were lying. Reality was something far different. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers had already crossed into North Korea, slipping into the mountains and hiding in the harsh terrain. They moved silently, using the darkness and the landscape itself as cover. They marched at night, carried little equipment, survived on handfuls of rice, and hid during the day. They were preparing for a massive, coordinated assault. And the United Nations forces, spread thin across impossible terrain, had no idea just how many enemies surrounded them. At the center of this storm was the 1st Marine Division, under the command of Major General Oliver P. Smith. His men were ordered to push north from the port of Hungnam into the icy mountains toward the Chosin Reservoir, linking up with army units advancing from the west. The goal was simple: crush the remaining North Korean resistance and end the war before Christmas. But as the Marines advanced up narrow mountain roads, General Smith grew uneasy. The terrain was steep, the roads fragile, and the temperatures were dropping rapidly, at times reaching 40 degrees below zero. Supplies were slow to arrive. Ammunition froze. Lubricants thickened. Engines stalled. Even the ground itself cracked under the cold. And there were signs everywhere that something was wrong. Civilians warned of Chinese troops in the hills. Patrols reported disturbing encounters at night. Strange bugle calls echoed across the mountains. But higher command insisted the Chinese presence was limited. Smith famously muttered one sentence that would define his leadership during the campaign. "We're not retreating. We're just attacking in a different direction." His caution would later save thousands of lives. By late November, the Marines reached the area around the Chosin Reservoir. a man-made lake surrounded by jagged ridges and narrow passes. The cold was unlike anything the Americans had ever experienced. Water froze inside canteens. Batteries died within minutes. Machine gun bolts seized up. Men wrapped their feet in layers of socks and rags, but still suffered frostbite that turned skin black. The landscape was as hostile as the enemy. The reservoir itself sat in a basin of ice, reflecting the pale winter sun. Snow crusted the hills like powdered glass. Every breath was a plume of vapor. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of boots and the distant howl of the wind. But beneath that surface calm, the Chinese army was preparing. On the night of November 27th, as the temperature plummeted to nearly 40 below zero, the Chinese struck. It began with sudden waves of bugle calls echoing through the darkness. Then mortars. Then the roar of thousands of troops rushing down the slopes. Chinese infantry, dressed in white camouflage, seemed to appear from nowhere. They charged in massed waves, firing rifles, throwing grenades, blowing whistles, and shouting battle cries that echoed across the ice. The Marines were stunned. Entire regiments of Chinese soldiers had materialized from the hills, attacking from multiple directions. The U.S. forces were completely surrounded. At Udamni, Hagaruri, and Kot-Ori, the small positions strung along the frozen roads, Marines fought desperately to hold their ground. Foxholes filled with drifting snow, weapons jammed, men fired rifles with bare hands, the cold biting into their skin. Corpsmen sprinted through enemy fire to reach wounded Marines, whose blood froze almost as soon as it touched the snow. Artillery crews worked frantically, struggling to keep their howitzers firing in the sub-zero temperatures. The Chinese attacks came in waves, one after another, throughout the night. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. It seemed impossible that any unit could survive such pressure. But the Marines did. They formed tight defensive perimeters, lighting up the night with muzzle flashes. Machine gun crews fired until their fingers bled. Mortars thumped rhythmically, sending explosions rippling across the hills. When ammunition ran low, they held with bayonets, fists, and sheer willpower. At dawn, as the first pale light spread across the mountains, the survivors surveyed the ground around them. Hundreds of Chinese bodies lay scattered across the slopes and frozen fields. The snow was stained dark. The air smelled of gunpowder and frost. The Marines had survived the night. But the battle was only beginning. The Chinese had not launched a single assault. They had launched an encirclement. Tens of thousands of troops now surrounded the U.S. forces, cutting off the only road leading back to the coast. If the Marines remained at Chosin, they would be overwhelmed. If they moved, they would have to fight through dozens of roadblocks, ambush points, and mountain passes held by the enemy. The situation was dire. But General Smith made a decision that would become legendary. He refused to call it a retreat. Instead, he ordered a fighting withdrawal, a march south through enemy territory, bringing out not only his soldiers, but also the wounded, the dead, and every piece of equipment he could save. It would become known as the Chosin Breakout, a march through hell, a 78-mile journey in sub-zero temperatures, a battle fought every step of the way. And for the Marines who began that march, the only question was simple. Could they survive it? When dawn broke on November 28, 1950, the sun offered no warmth. The air itself felt solid, as if the cold had weight. The Marines at Udamni and Hagaruri rose from their shallow positions stiff and numb, their clothing frozen into rigid layers. Helmets were rimmed with frost. Faces were pale and cracked. Breath emerged in thick clouds. Many had slept little, if at all, after repelling wave after wave of Chinese attacks. All around them lay the silence that follows violence. The snow was churned with footprints, craters, and fallen bodies. Rifles and equipment left behind by the Chinese glinted in the morning light before freezing over. For the Marines, the scene was both horrifying and sobering. They had survived the first night, but the enemy had not withdrawn. They were regrouping. General Oliver P. Smith understood the terrain better than most. He had insisted on building an airstrip at Hagaruri before the fighting even began. A decision that his superiors questioned at the time, but which now proved essential. Without that runway, evacuation, resupply, and reinforcement would have been nearly impossible. Even so, the situation that morning was grim. The Marines were spread across a line of frozen mountain positions more than 70 miles from the sea. Between them lay narrow, winding roads carved into the mountainside, roads the Chinese now controlled. Every pass, every ridge, every bend in the road was a potential kill zone. The 1st Marine Division was surrounded by an estimated 120,000 Chinese troops. The Marines numbered fewer than 15,000. Outnumbered 10 to 1. Isolated. Frozen. Running low on ammunition and food. And yet, not a single Marine considered surrender. At Udamni, the northernmost position, the Marines prepared to move first. Their orders were clear but daunting. Fight their way east to Hagaruri, link up with the forces there, and then continue south. It would require breaking through Chinese divisions positioned along steep ridgelines that looked down directly onto the road. This road would become one of the most infamous stretches of terrain in U.S. military history. Soldiers called it the Frozen Highway. Others simply called it Hellfire Valley. As the columns formed, Marines loaded what ammunition they had left into their weapons. Machine gun crews checked and rechecked their belts. Corpsmen wrapped blankets around wounded men who would be carried on jeeps, sleds, or makeshift litters. No one would be left behind, not even the dead. In this bitter landscape, companionship and duty were all that remained to tie the men together. Shortly after midday, the withdrawal began. The first units moved cautiously, scanning the ridges. The cold made every sound sharp, the crunch of boots on snow, the metallic click of a rifle bolt, the rumble of a truck engine struggling in the freezing air. The road wound along cliffs, flanked by rocky peaks that seemed designed for ambush. The Chinese struck quickly. Machine gun fire erupted from the high ground, sending bullets snapping over the heads of the Marines. Mortar shells rained down, their explosions muffled only slightly by the snow. Chinese infantry swarmed down the slopes, firing as they came, trying to overwhelm the convoy. Marines returning fire watched their rounds spark against the ice and rock. Coordinated volleys pushed the attackers back, but only temporarily. Each time the Marines moved, the enemy repositioned, filling the hillsides like shadows. Progress was slow, painfully slow. Trucks slipped on the icy road, jeeps stalled, frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes. Any man who removed his glove for more than a moment risked losing the use of his hand. Weapons had to be cleared of ice constantly. A single jam could mean death. Even breathing felt like inhaling knives. Yet the Marines pressed on. And in the sky above them, salvation appeared in the form of transport aircraft and cargo planes. Thanks to the airstrip at Hagaruri and countless acts of heroism by pilots, supplies began dropping to the Marines. parachutes carrying ammunition, rations, blankets, medical kits, and even boots floated down like strange winter flowers. Some parachutes drifted into Chinese territory. Others were lost to the wind. But enough landed among the Marines to keep them fighting. Every supply drop meant another day of survival. The march from Udamni to Hagaruri took days that felt like years. Each night, the temperature dropped so low that exposed skin froze instantly. Trees cracked in the cold like rifle shots. Fires were nearly impossible to start, and those who tried risked creating visible targets. Chinese troops attacked relentlessly throughout the nights. Their strategy was to wear the Marines down through repeated assaults, not necessarily to win quickly, but to exhaust them, break their morale, and cut off the wounded. Bugles, whistles, and shouted orders pierced the darkness moments before each attack. Sometimes hundreds of Chinese soldiers would rush the Marine lines. Other times, thousands. They came in waves, each one crashing against the defensive positions like the tide. The Marines, exhausted and freezing, repelled each attack with disciplined fire and unyielding courage. One Marine later described the nights as endless nightmares of shadows and snow. Another said simply, "I don't remember being warm for 11 days." At one point, a Marine rifle company dwindled from more than 200 men to fewer than 60. Not from cowardice or surrender, but from sheer attrition. Frostbite, wounds, and exhaustion claimed almost as many lives as enemy bullets. Still, the columns marched. Hagaruri was the linchpin. Without it, the Marines could not link up, could not be resupplied, and could not escape. The tiny village, located at the base of towering hills, held the only airstrip capable of handling evacuation flights. And the Chinese knew it. They launched a massive assault to seize the village. Waves of infantry crashed into the defensive perimeter, trying to overwhelm the thin line of Marines, Army engineers, and British Royal Marines holding the position. For hours, the battle raged in subzero darkness. Tracer rounds streaked through the air. Mortars exploded in fountains of ice. The defenders held on with everything they had, firing until their rifles froze, then thawing the bolts beneath their coats. At dawn, the snow was littered with the bodies of fallen attackers. The defenders were shaken, exhausted, and running critically low on ammunition. But they had held. When the first units from Udamni reached Hagaruri, the relief was indescribable. Men embraced. Some cried. Others simply collapsed in the snow, unable to stand another second. But there was no time to rest. South of Hagaruri lay Kotori, another village under siege. And beyond that, the treacherous Funchalen Pass, where the Chinese had destroyed a vital bridge. Without that bridge, the Marines would be trapped. On December 7th, American reconnaissance planes spotted the blackened remains of a steel bridge hanging over a deep gorge. The Chinese had blown it up, knowing it was the only road to the coast. If the Marines could not cross, they would be forced into the mountains, and likely annihilated. For 5 days, the Marines fought their way toward the gorge, knowing that every step brought them closer to either survival or death. Miraculously, the Air Force provided a solution that would become one of the most daring feats of the Korean War. They airdropped portable treadway bridge sections, massive steel panels, by parachute. Several missed the drop zone. Some crashed, but enough survived to be hauled into position manually by freezing, exhausted Marines. Under constant threat of ambush, engineers assembled the bridge across the shattered gap. On December 9th, the first Marine vehicles crossed. The path to the coast was open, but the fighting was not over. The Chinese attacked constantly, desperate to crush the fleeing column. Artillery fire echoed through the valleys. Snipers targeted drivers. Convoys crawled along the mountain roads as engineers cleared mines and repaired damage. On December 11th, the first elements of the division reached the port city of Hungnam. They had traveled 78 miles through enemy territory, in temperatures that killed exposed men in minutes, while fighting the largest ambush in Marine Corps history. Of the roughly 15,000 Marines who entered the mountains, nearly 1,500 had been killed or wounded. Chinese losses were estimated at 25,000 to 40,000, many from exposure. By the time the last Marines boarded ships at Hungnam, the name Chosin had already begun to echo across the world. Newspapers described it as a miracle. Military historians called it one of the greatest fighting withdrawals in history. Marines who survived were given a title that would follow them for the rest of their lives: the Chosin Few. They had not retreated. They had not broken. They had not surrendered. They had fought their way out of a trap that should have destroyed them. And they had brought out their wounded, their dead, and their honor intact. But the cost had been immense, physically, emotionally, and strategically. And as the snow-covered mountains of North Korea faded into the distance, every surviving Marine carried with him the memory of frozen nights, endless attacks, and brothers lost along the road. When the last Marines reached Hungnam, the port was a hive of desperate activity. Tens of thousands of refugees crowded the docks, hoping for passage south. Ships bobbed in the icy harbor, their decks stacked with equipment, supplies, and wounded soldiers. The air stung with the salt of the sea and the sharp bite of winter wind. But to the men coming down from the mountains, Hungnam felt almost warm, almost safe. The entire evacuation was under pressure. Chinese armies were closing in from every direction. Every hour mattered. Ships had to be loaded with precision. First the wounded, then refugee families, then equipment, all while maintaining defensive positions around the port. The Marines who trickled into Hungnam were ghosts of the men who had marched north weeks earlier. Their faces were hollow, lips cracked and blue. Frostbite had turned fingertips black. Many had their feet wrapped in layers of rags because their boots had frozen solid. Their weapons were worn and battered, the metal scratched by ice and snow. But their eyes held something other forces in Korea could not understand: a quiet, unshakable steel. They had survived something few armies in history had faced: a fighting withdrawal through mountains swarming with enemies, in temperatures colder than most men could endure. Every Marine who reached Hungnam carried a story, and every story was carved from the ice of Chosin. As they reached the port, some sat on crates in silence, staring at the sea. Others huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets, canteens, and cigarettes. Corpsmen checked frostbite wounds. Officers tried to account for their men. Every now and then, a name shouted across the snow would be answered by a weary voice, a brief smile, or the simple relief of a familiar face stepping out of the column. Still, some names were met with silence. Those the Marines could not bring back were mourned quietly. Their bodies, wrapped in whatever cloth the men had, were laid carefully near the evacuation points. No one spoke at length. In moments like these, grief was heavy, but its expression was simple: a bowed head, a hand on a shoulder, a promise that the fallen would not be forgotten. The evacuation fleet grew larger by the hour. Navy destroyers, transports, and cargo ships lined the piers. The cold wind rattled loose equipment and snapped at flags. There was a rush to load everything: troops, civilians, vehicles, before Chinese artillery could get within range. By December 24th, as Christmas approached, the port was ready for the final stage. The last Marines stepped aboard the ships, pausing one final time to look back at the snow-covered mountains they had fought through. For many, leaving felt surreal. The Chosin Reservoir had been a world of its own, a frozen battlefield where every second demanded courage, endurance, and resolve. As the engines rumbled and the ships began pulling away from the docks, the Marines watched Hungnam recede into the cold mist. Behind them, demolition teams planted explosives. When the final ships were clear, mountains of supplies and equipment that could not be evacuated were destroyed in a thunderous eruption that lit the horizon. Hungnam burned behind them. The port was gone. The Marines were safe. The war, however, was far from over. The retreat from Chosin was not a defeat, not in the sense military historians usually measure. The Marines had completed their mission, held their units together, and inflicted staggering losses on the Chinese army, but the human cost was enormous. Nearly 1,000 Marines were killed. Thousands more were wounded. Frostbite crippled many. Some would never regain feeling in their fingers, toes, or faces. Others lost limbs. Every man who survived carried scars, physical or emotional, that would follow him for the rest of his life. Chinese casualties were far higher. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers froze, starved, or died in battle around Chosin. Many had marched into Korea wearing only thin cotton uniforms and canvas shoes. Their sheer courage and willingness to fight through such conditions shocked the world. But the Chinese intervention changed the course of the war. The advance to the Yalu was over. The idea of victory by Christmas evaporated. The war would grind on for years, a brutal seesaw conflict that would devastate the peninsula again and again. Yet even in the darkest days that followed, the story of the Marines at Chosin served as a symbol of hope and resilience. Generals pointed to it as proof that courage could overcome impossible odds. Journalists wrote about the Chosin Few, praising their determination. Marines told stories of shared hardships, bonding generations together through a legacy of pride and pain. Survivors of Chosin carried home memories too deep for words. For some, the hardest part was not the fighting, but the cold. Men recalled nights where eyelids froze shut, where breath turned to ice on blankets, where frostbite crept up legs like a slow, invisible enemy. Others remembered the faces of Chinese soldiers, young, thin, wrapped in makeshift winter clothing. Many of them died not from bullets, but from exposure. The misery of Chosin belonged to both sides. Some veterans spoke of moments of unexpected humanity. A wounded Marine giving his last blanket to a comrade, a corpsman working for hours with numb fingers to save a man's life, a group of Marines dragging the dead behind them because leaving them behind was unthinkable. One Marine later said, "It wasn't heroism, it was loyalty. You couldn't leave your brother behind." Another described Chosin as a place where every man found out what he was made of. Many never spoke of the battle at all. The memories were too heavy. The freezing nights, the endless attacks, the sight of friends lying silent in the snow. These were burdens carried quietly by the men who lived through them. In the decades after the war, the Chosin Reservoir campaign became one of the most studied battles in military history. Scholars examined its logistics, tactics, and brutal environmental conditions. Military academies used it as a case study in leadership under impossible circumstances. But for the Marines, the meaning of Chosin was simpler. It was a story of endurance, of leaving no man behind, of walking through a world of ice and death, and refusing to surrender. Chosin was not a victory in the traditional sense. It didn't lead to strategic gains or territorial expansion. It didn't shift the balance of the war, but it proved something far more important, that the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, can achieve the impossible. The Marines broke out of a trap that should have ended them. They carried their wounded. They carried their dead. They kept their unit intact. And they walked out together. Few battles in American history match the sheer odds faced at Chosin. Fewer still can match the bravery displayed. Today, monuments around the United States bear the names of the Chosin Few. Veterans reunite each year to remember the frozen hell they survived. Families gather to honor those who never came home. The phrase, Chosin Few, has become synonymous with almost superhuman perseverance. In Korea, the landscape around the reservoir is quiet now. Snow still blankets the mountains in winter. The lake still freezes into a sheet of pale blue glass. The wind still whistles through the pines, a whisper of the storms that once raged there. But if you stand in those hills and listen carefully, you can almost imagine the echoes of that long-ago winter. The crackle of gunfire, the crunch of boots in snow, the distant, haunting sound of bugles, the low murmur of men encouraging each other in the dark. And behind it all, the unbreakable determination of those who refused to fall. The Chosin Reservoir was not a place of victory. It was a place of survival, a crucible of ice and fire, a moment in history where ordinary men endured extraordinary hardship and showed the world what strength truly looks like. They were outnumbered, surrounded, frozen, exhausted, and yet they fought their way out. The Chosin Few, forever remembered, forever honored.